Okay, so we're talking about Daniel 9:27, or the 70th week of Daniel, the final 7 years out of 490 years that we discussed in the prior video. If you haven't watched part 1, I would suggest that you watch that if you have the time, so that you know the breakdown of this. But the tribulation, which is the 70th week of Daniel, again is the final 7 years out of 490 years decreed for Daniel's people, the Jews, in Daniel 9:24. We had 483 years of the 490 that were fulfilled already. They began with the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem in 444 BC that we see in Nehemiah 2, and were completed. The 483, or 69 sets of 7, were completed when the Anointed One, Israel's Messiah, Jesus, came and was cut off, referencing a violent death that we see in Daniel 9:24 through 26. And then we come to that final 7 years. So when is that final 7 years, and how do we know that that 70th week of Daniel, or those final 7 years decreed for the Jews, is the same thing as the 7-year tribulation? Well, let's look at some passages and see how we can know that they are one and the same. Let's go back to Daniel 9:27 again, though, first, and read that one more time. He, referencing the Antichrist, we learned from the prior verse that he, this ruler that is to come, is of the people that destroyed the city and the sanctuary, referencing the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD by the Romans. So we know that this he person, which is the Antichrist, is from the revived Roman Empire. He will confirm a covenant with many for 1 7-year time frame. In the middle of those 7 years, in the middle of the 7, he will put an end to sacrifice and offering. You can't have sacrifice and offering without a temple, so we know that the temple will be rebuilt during this 70th week of Daniel, because it's been destroyed nearly 2,000 years prior, because we haven't come to that yet, so we know at this point we're 2,000 years from it. He will put an end to sacrifice and offering, and on a wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. So this Antichrist is associated with an abomination of desolation and a stopping of the sacrifices and the offerings that are being made in the temple during this 70th week of Daniel, or 7 years, final 7 years decreed for the Jews in Daniel 9:24 through 27. So how do we know that that's the same thing as the tribulation, a future event? If we go to Matthew 24, Jesus had just told the disciples about the coming destruction of the temple, that no stone was going to be left upon another, and they asked him these questions. They said, "When will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" So Jesus begins to respond to those questions. Some of the answers are recorded in Matthew and some in the book of Luke, in I believe it's chapter 21. In Luke, it records the answer to "when will this happen," referencing the destruction of the temple, because we see in that account that when the Jews are told to flee to the mountains, that they are then captured and scattered to the nations, that Jerusalem is surrounded, and that they are told to flee. They flee, and they are scattered. They're slaughtered and scattered to the nations. That does not happen in the tribulation. So that event, the answer to that question was recorded by Luke, but not in Matthew. Matthew talks about all end time events in Matthew 24. He references what it's going to be like prior to the tribulation, what's going to happen specifically at mid-trib through to the second coming. He talks about the sign, the most phenomenal prophetic sign of the end days, the one that kicks off the end days, and that is the restoration of Israel as a nation, fulfilling the passage in 24 here, 32 through 34, in the lesson of the fig tree being Israel. When Israel was restored as a nation in 1948, that began the end day clock ticking, and we're told by Jesus that the generation that saw that event will also see the fulfillment of all of the prophecies that he referenced in this chapter. So the fulfillment of the balance of end day prophecy from the restoration of Israel till the second coming of Christ is going to be fulfilled in that generation that saw Israel restored as a nation. But again, how do we know that the 70th week of Daniel is also the tribulation? We have Jesus talking about this end day tribulation, events that take place in it, in Matthew 24. And beginning in verse 15, he says, and we know we're at mid-trib here as we go through it because of what he says. So when you see standing in the holy place, referencing the temple, the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel. So he references the abomination of desolation that Daniel mentions in 9:27. When you see that, let the reader understand. He's saying, this is the fulfillment of Daniel 9:27, and this is what you need to do. He says, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of time, from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. The elect there is those that will flee, that will be obedient to this. They will flee to the mountains. They will be protected according to Revelation 12 for the last 3.5 years of the tribulation, because they're going to be obedient to Christ's command here. So we know that this 1/3 of the Jews that is also referenced in Zechariah 12, the third that during the tribulation do come to Christ, they see what Jesus says, they clearly listen to the teaching, preaching of the two supernatural witnesses from Revelation 7 and 11, and the 144,000 Jewish men that are preaching during the tribulation. They listen to them, they hear them, they believe what they say at some point about who Messiah is, and they are obedient to Christ's command to flee to the wilderness. They understand that the prophet Daniel, this abomination of desolation that Jesus is referencing, that the prophet Daniel spoke of, is when the Antichrist, according to 2 Thessalonians 2, not only stops the sacrifices and the offerings, as we're told in Daniel 9:27, but does something even beyond that we also see in the book of Daniel. And that is found in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 4. He will oppose and will exalt himself over everything that is called God or is worshipped, so that he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. So in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel, we have the Antichrist stopping these sacrifices and offerings. In the middle of the tribulation, we have Jesus saying, look for this abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of. We know from 2 Thessalonians 2, he also literally proclaims to be God when he goes into the temple and stops the sacrifices and offerings. And this is one of the most powerful, or clearest, I should say, prophecies from Scripture matching the 70th week of Daniel with the 7-year tribulation prophesied in Revelation